When you start to learn calligraphy, finding the best calligraphy paper to use when you're practicing is an important first step.
And trust us, it'll save you a lot of frustration. We'll show you why in this video.
Yes. So today we're going to compare some calligraphy paper and help you choose the right one, depending on if you're practicing with brush pen, dip pen, or other pens that you have at home.
And there are so many things to look out for when trying to find the best calligraphy paper that it's hard to kind of pick the most important thing, but we've narrowed it down to the most important for brush pen and pointed pen.
So for practicing calligraphy with brush pens, the most important thing to look for is smooth paper. If you use paper that's too rough, then it can damage your pens and be harder to use, and it's very frustrating. So our favorite brand of smooth paper is Canson marker paper. Just keep watching the video though, because we want to make sure that you're not using the wrong kind of smooth paper, and we'll mention that later.
So if you're using a pointed pen, smooth paper will definitely be less frustrating to use because rough paper can actually make your pen get caught on the fibers. But even more important than smoothness is the absorbency, or rather the lack of absorbency. So with pointed pen, you use liquid ink that you're dipping your pen into. And if your paper is too absorbent, then the ink will be soaked up like a sponge and it will feather and it will bleed into the page. So you want to actually look for something that is not very absorbent. One kind of paper that we really like using for this is HP Premium 32-pound paper.
So there are two main uses of why you would use different types of paper. So if you're doing calligraphy, you're probably either practicing or you're creating a final piece. And you'd want to use different paper depending on either of those use cases.
Number one tip for practicing is using a guide sheet, and you can watch our video about why to use a guide sheet for practicing calligraphy. And so there are two options that you can use to get guide sheets on your paper. Number one, you can print your guidelines directly on paper. So you can use something like the HP Premium 32-pound paper that we just mentioned. We also do have workbooks that you can print out on printer paper, and make sure you're using the printer paper we recommend so that your ink doesn't bleed.
Yep, and in our workbooks we have areas for you to trace letters and practice on your own, which is a really good way to learn.
You can also use paper on top of a worksheet in two different ways. Number one with marker paper, and number two with a light pad.
So here's an example of using with marker paper. You can see the marker paper is semi-transparent, so you can see through it. When you have the guide sheet underneath, you can put your semi-transparent paper on top and see right through it, but when you take the guide sheets away, the lines are no longer visible. Or with a light pad, you can use a light that shines up through the paper so that you can see the guide lines underneath your paper, but then again, your lines won't appear when you're done practicing.
And this is also great because then you don't have to worry about erasing pencil lines. We also did want to mention that you can buy practice pads with pre-printed guidelines. We don't always recommend doing this though, because you want to make sure that the size of the guidelines is specific to the pen you're using and the style of calligraphy that you're using. So it's a lot easier to just print your own. You can get some from the description of this video and print your own.
Okay, so we've talked about using paper for practicing, but if you're creating a final piece, you probably want to use something that's a little bit higher quality, a little bit thicker than marker paper. And so now we're going to talk about creating final pieces.
So if you are creating something like a framed calligraphy piece versus something that needs a little bit more structure or standing on its own, like a place card, for example, you can use different types of paper. So the place card would obviously need to be something thicker and more sturdy. You can use cardstock for this. Now, cardstock isn't going to be like the most smooth paper in the world. Like we talked about, it's very important to use smooth paper. So one way that you can kind of get around this is setting aside dedicated pens, dedicated brush pens to use just for your cardstock projects, so that you don't have to worry about them getting frayed. Another pro tip is to get extra pens if you're doing a project like this, because cardstock is also absorbent and it will kind of suck away the ink from the pen. So you want to make sure you have extra pens on hand.
So something else to note about doing a final piece is that you probably don't want lines on your paper. Like for practicing, it's fine to have the lines showing up, but for a final piece, you don't really want that. So of course, something like cardstock is not transparent enough to see through to have a guide sheet underneath. You could use a ruler and draw with pencil lines very lightly and then erase those at the end, or you could use a light pad again. So as long as you're not using black cardstock, you can use a light pad, make sure it's up, brightness is all the way up, maybe dim the lights in your room so you can see through it, and that will work well. So if you're using dark paper, what would you recommend?
If you're using dark paper, you can actually draw pencil guidelines. We have a whole video showing you how to do that. Just a word of caution, if you are going to draw pencil lines, whether it's on dark paper or light paper, make sure your piece has time to dry at least 24 hours before you attempt to erase the lines. You can also get like a really tiny eraser, and that's like only like very thin, so that you're only touching where the lines are on your paper, so you don't risk smearing the ink or smudging it or ruining what you just made. So we've talked about some important things when you're choosing a calligraphy paper to practice with. Now we want to talk about some warning signs, things to watch out for, and mistakes that we see.
And mistakes we've made on our own, too. Things that we've dealt with, which have been frustrating. So what's one mistake?
So first is using low quality paper, especially for pointed pen, because like we said before, if your paper is very absorbent or if it's just really thin, then your ink is going to start bleeding, and that's so frustrating. Also, you might get little shreds of paper that are caught in the nib, which makes it impossible to get thin lines. Also super frustrating.
Mm-hmm. And like we said before, using smooth paper for brush pens is super important to avoid damaging your pens. So if you've ever used a damaged brush pen, you can tell it's like frayed. It's very hard to get crisp lines. It's so annoying, and it just ruins your brush pens, and then you have to buy new ones.
But what kind of smooth paper do you specifically not want to use?
Yes, so don't use glossy paper like photo paper. Even though it's smooth, the ink is actually just going to kind of pool on it, and it just won't look very nice.
And it will smear, it won't dry. And then another warning is to use a guard sheet so that oils from your hand don't get on the paper. So what this looks like, especially for a pointed pen, is you have your paper that you're writing on, and then on top of that you put another piece of paper to guard your hand from touching the paper.
So there's lots of other characteristics about paper that we can look at. We've touched on absorbency a little bit, but let's go a little bit deeper.
Yeah, so how can you tell if a paper is absorbent, too absorbent, not absorbent enough, especially for pointed pen ink? This is really hard to tell unless you actually test out the paper. So I recommend first testing any paper you have already and see if you can find one that works well. And if not, then you can get one of the recommendations that we gave you. We've done a lot of testing different pens on different kinds of paper. And one common thing that I noticed with printer paper is that paper that has color lock technology, and you can tell on the package of the paper, it's an additive that's incorporated into the paper. This is from their website, that locks the pigment in the surface. And without this technology, paper acts more like a sponge, absorbing the colors into the paper and away from the surface. So again, having this color lock makes it less absorbent, which is good for using ink. You can also look for something that specifically says bleed proof. So bleed proof is an invisible coating that lifts ink away from the page. This also resists absorption and prevents the ink from bleeding. It also makes it so that the ink doesn't bleed through to the other side of the paper. So marker paper is a good example of that.
So let's talk about weight of paper or thickness. So you may have seen on a package of paper like 32 pound, or if you're not in the US, you see the abbreviation GSM. So GSM stands for grams per square meter. Pounds, like 32 pound, is how many pounds a certain number of sheets of that paper weigh. So really the number is important, but basically the higher the number, the thicker the paper, and you can tell. So something like marker paper, which is thin, is 18-pound paper.
And that's why it's semi-transparent, because it's so thin.
And then something like watercolor paper could be 140 pounds. So that's kind of the scale. So like regular copy paper is somewhere in the 20-pound range. So we really like 32-pound paper, for example.
Another characteristic of paper is the finish, and there's different types of finish. Like we were saying, glossy is one type of finish. Different kinds of paper for different uses have different finishes. The main thing, again, to look out for is just the smoothness of it.
And even if a paper feels smooth to your hand, like at a microscopic level, it might be pretty rough. So that's, again, why we stress the importance of getting smooth paper like Canson marker paper or the HP premium paper.
If you're using paper for a final piece, we talked a little bit about the differences between practicing and using it for a final piece. You want to look for something that is acid-free, because acid-free paper prevents it from yellowing over time to ensure long-lasting quality. You can also make sure to look for ink that is archival or light fast. It might say that either of those words on the pen, and pigmented ink is better for archival quality.
Tell us in the comments below, what kind of paper are you practicing on? Is there anything that we've missed, anything that we should try out? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear what you have to say.
And if you'd like to expand your calligraphy skills, we do teach online calligraphy courses, and we would love to have you as a student.
So make sure you check out the description below to find all of these resources and more information. And thanks again for watching.